Here begins the third and final segment of my Pencast conversation with Ana Hinojosa, formerly Executive Director of U.S. Customs and Border Protection and now head of ABH Global Trade Consulting. Say a little bit about the legal framework for forced labor that exists in the EU. There is a forced labor ban, if I'm not mistaken, but nothing specific to the Uyghur situation. Is that correct?
That's correct. At this point, there isn't any specific designation of a geographic prohibited region. Some of that work will be something that whatever entity in the EU will be responsible for investigating. Where there is a high risk of forced labor, we'll have to make those determinations. Clearly, the EU has come out and expressed concerns about the human rights situations in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and so I would not guess that they'll be able to ignore that. But per se, there isn't currently a geographic identification of a prohibited region of the world in any part of the world as of yet.
I see. Okay. And so the legal, let's say, tools and the clarity with which enforcement actions will actually be taken isn't perfect anywhere, and still leaves a fair bit to be desired in the EU.
Oh, well, for sure. I mean, this is new territory for the EU. I think that in some respects the EU law is stronger than the US law in its consequence delivery, where it's a little less clear maybe at this point and less I don't know what the right word is, but I think less transparent for the private sector on exactly how it's going to work. The EU is always very focused on transparency and guidance and those kinds of things. And I'm confident that once September rolls around, that many EU institutions are going to be working very hard on bringing about that guidance and clarity. And I'm happy to help if anybody needs my help. But I think a big part of that will be the actual implementation on how it's gonna. I think it's important to have that transparency and ensure that they instill somewhat uniform implementation across the member states. Mm-hmm. Because if they don't focus on clear guidance and harmonized implementation, then companies who are looking to circumvent the requirements will find the weakest link. They'll find which customs administration is not looking. In the U.S., we call that port shopping, where they look to see who's not paying attention to a particular thing, and they try to get the bad goods or the bad people in through those ports. So I think that it will be incumbent on that entity that's going to be conducting those investigations, especially those first ones out the gate, to make sure that they not only investigate what they're doing, but also clearly communicate with the implementing agencies to ensure that they understand and have met all of their obligations. I know that in Canada, there was a case that was lost. A case of a forced labor detention that was lost because Canada Border Services had not previously put out a guidance document or put out a public notice about this enforcement to be started, and that hampered their enforcement capabilities. So there's a lot of steps in kind of understanding the legislation and the legislative framework under which those agencies work to ensure that their enforcement is effective.
Mm-hmm. There again, you're putting on your lawyer's hat. You may not have gone to law school, but you're having to think like a prosecutor and saying, okay, what tools do we need? What do we need in place here in order to not interfere with, but actually facilitate a prosecution? Now,
We will come back to the forced labor issue, which I know is very much front and center in your work, and it'll take part in a very interesting case study. I mean, a very important meeting that you took part in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam recently. But I just want to take one step back and say now, 2 years after your retirement from Customs and Border Protection and from public service, you lead ABH Global Trade Consulting. Tell us a bit about ABH, what the organization does, your role there, and how you coordinate work with your pool of consultants.
Thank you. So ABH started because after I retired, some folks that knew that I retired reached out to me and said they were looking to hire me to do consulting work. And I said, well, I'm not ready to do consulting work. I'd like to take some time off. That was brief. And so at the beginning of 22, I kind of hung out my little shingle of ABH Consulting, and I expected it to be, one client here, one client there. And before you knew it, I had 5 clients. And then I've had, some of those clients are still my clients, which is really fantastic. Mm-hmm. And then I've had some more ad hoc clients that come in for certain problems that people have gotten themselves in, companies have gotten themselves into. And I mean, to be clear, no company is without any areas of compliance that they have gaps in. So everybody can improve, every company can improve their compliance methodologies, especially as it relates to forced labor and other areas. But so I started, helping one client who is a technology solutions provider who was a new company. They do transparency into supply chains. It's an AI powered company. They were a small company at the time, and I really was very excited to work with them because I don't consider myself a super techie person. And so this was fascinating to me. It was another growth opportunity for me. I didn't know how I would be able to give them something that would be useful. But it turns out that they don't need me to help with the tech part. They need me to help with the concept part and what problems need to be solved by the technology. They will do the technology part. So that works out great. And this company, called Altana AI, and they are able to work on global transparency on supply chains. And so they've recently, even as it relates to the EU, they've been doing some work on carbon measurement. And so they're able to help companies be able to better assess what their carbon footprint is. They also do that, of course, for sanctions monitoring, for forced labor concerns in certain regions of the world where you need to know beneficial ownership of all the tiers of your supply chain. So it's really fascinating. And so I started working with them on them building their infrastructure, and as different challenges in supply chain transparency, supply chain traceability, new and emerging laws in different parts of the world. I've been able to help them interpret those laws, interpret the implementation, how that's going to be implemented, how that's going to work, for U.S. companies exporting abroad or for foreign companies importing into the U.S. And so that's really what ABH does. I have an amazing group of consultants that are people that I know that I've worked with in the past, and I use them as needed. So like, for example, I can do classification. I can do harmonized tariff schedule classification because I grew up in customs, but it's been a long time since I've done classification. And so, it could take me a really long time to verify your classifications, but thankfully I don't have to, because I have experts on my team that do nothing but classification and valuation, and they can do that a lot faster, more efficiently, and probably more accurately than I could if I had to do it myself. So
that's the benefit. Not only when the people hire you, not only do they get your immense expertise, but they get your immense Rolodex and all the contacts you've made over the decades. That makes a pretty impressive team.
Yeah. So it's, we're not a big consulting company. We have niche expertise, and we're not looking for volumes of jobs. I think we're looking to make a difference. We're looking to have integrity in the work that we're doing. We're looking for companies or, whoever we're supporting to have compliance as their goal. And if that's the goal, then we want to work with them. If that's not the goal, they're not the client for us.
I realize that some of your work at ABH may be confidential, but what can you tell me about your recent meeting in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam and your work with Cotton Council International? It sounds like a fascinating get-together.
It is, and I'm heading back there in September.
Fantastic!
So I'll be going to Indonesia and Vietnam again on behalf of the Cotton Council International. So the Cotton Council International is the U.S. export promotion arm of representing the U.S. cotton growers. And cotton is still one of those commodities that the U.S. produces quite a bit of. And so it's really important to make sure that, to the extent that there are strategic advantages for sourcing U.S. cotton, that those be maintained through supply chain traceability. And what that means is, if there's a high risk, I'll be as clear as possible, but there's a high risk when you're talking about cotton, that with China producing 20% of the world's cotton and 95% of that coming from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, that cotton out of China, which represents a large percentage of what's out there, is likely prohibited coming into the United States. And so many companies have decided that they're not going to source cotton from China because the risk is too high. So they're importing cotton. They're still doing business in China because China still has great manufacturing operations, both, yarn, fabric, and cut and sew facilities. So they are exporting U.S. cotton into China or Vietnam or the Philippines or other places that have similar manufacturing facilities. But what's important is, if you're importing into those countries U.S. cotton because you know that that's not prohibited cotton, you need to keep it as not prohibited cotton. And so part of what I'm being asked to do is go and speak to the manufacturers in those countries and talk to them about supply chain traceability, supply chain transparency, and what are some of the documents and records that they need to do to ensure that they keep their U.S. cotton segregated, that they keep it well identified, so that their clients down the line are not going to have trouble when those products are imported into the United States.
Right. I wrote an entire book on olive oil fraud, and one of the great games there is to have a massive amount on paper of a massive quantity of really, really high grade olive oil, but then replace it, under the table with lower grade stuff and sell it as a high grade stuff. And that sounds like, if you don't have total supply chain transparency in cotton in China, you could be having people delivering cotton from the Xinjiang region, let's say after hours, and blending lower grade or cheaper cotton with your U.S. cotton. That's a big risk.
Yeah, and it would be a shame, because in most cases it's not going to be the importer. It's going to be maybe a less focused manufacturer that doesn't really understand the implications of commingling the cotton. but the consequences are huge, because not only does it taint the cotton, but it will taint the importer of record and then taint the whole manufacturing operation. So if it was just a one-time fluke, it's going to be very difficult for them to restore the reputation of that manufacturer.
Wow.
And even the importer, and the U.S. government has capability to do isotopic testing and trace element analysis on cotton from the finished product, as does the private sector if they engage with certain providers that offer those kind of services. And so the government is doing quite a bit of that testing to ensure that what people are claiming is in the cotton is actually what's in there, and there's a lot of enforcement happening.
What were your main takeaways from your meetings in Vietnam with the Cotton Council International? I mean, what are the most effective mechanisms for ensuring transparency and traceability up in country in China and in transit?
The Cotton Council does have a U.S. Cotton Trust Protocol where they do allow the people who are buying U.S. cotton to kind of register their cotton and then decrement as they're using it. So it has a little bit of a control mechanism to ensure that they aren't exporting, 3 times as much cotton as what they actually registered as purchasing. So there's that little bit there. But even further than that, many multinational companies are implementing different risk management approaches that would include the traceability aspects of vetting, for example, through an Altana against companies that are on the entity list, and companies on the UFLPA entity list are companies that the U.S. government has found ties to either state-owned enterprises or some of the forced labor transfer companies in China, et cetera. So you have to vet against those. And then you have to have a trust but verify system where, at least as it relates to cotton, many companies are implementing isotopic testing through one of the companies that has the largest reference library for cotton is Oratane, and they do that isotopic testing with trace element analysis, and they're able to take a finished product that contains cotton, put it through a chemical through a laboratory analysis to take a look at the isotopic testing and the trace elements, and then create this origin, a fingerprint, bounce that up against their vast cotton mapping library, and tell that company where that cotton came from, whether it came from the U.S. as declared, or whether it came from China, or whether it came from Burkina Faso, or wherever that cotton may have come from.
Amazing.
So what you asked about the takeaways. I think one of the biggest takeaways, I had a really good exchange with some of the manufacturers in a kind of a closed door executive roundtable, so that some of these executives had a little bit more freedom to speak and ask questions in a smaller forum. And one of the things that I kept hearing from them is, every time there's a new requirement that happens in the US or in the EU, that trickles down to the client expecting the manufacturer to take a discount or to somehow help them recover the cost of their compliance. And he said, time and time again, we're having to cut our prices and somehow absorb these extra supply chain compliance requirements.
So we're talking audits and testing and that sort of thing?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I know that there's a really big benefit to be able to have testing done, like, for example, at the fabric mills or at the yarn spinners, because then if you're able to test at the fabric level, then whatever happens after that is likely compliant if the fabric is compliant. And so it's important to get down to that level, but that importer sometimes is not paying for that. They're expecting their manufacturer to pay for that. And some of that, it's really difficult to hear how, they've many countries like Vietnam, although Vietnam has prospered economically, how they're basically have the trickle down costs and absorption of compliance. So it's not just the big multinational company being compliant, but they're negotiating down their contracts to force these manufacturers in these developing countries to absorb that cost.
Wow, that's and you were having this closed door executive roundtable to discuss this sort of the suffering that this causes at the level of actual producers and workers.
Yeah, so that was kind of a byproduct of it. It was really about ask me what, some of the questions that you're not going to be comfortable asking me in the open, conference space,
right.
For compliance. So I wanted to give them a comfortable place to ask their questions about the application of the law, about how, any questions that they have on how that works coming into the United States. And some of those questions were asked because they can't believe that the law is as broad as it is, and in fact it is, and they can't believe that the expectations that they keep hearing are really the expectations of the government, and unfortunately they are. And so they just need to hear it from somebody else that can confirm that there are consequences for not putting the right controls in place to ensure that any high risk inputs into your product are not incorporated.
Huh. I see. Well, it must have been very, very productive set of meetings because you're going back to Vietnam and also to Indonesia in September. It sounds like a productive collaboration.
It has been, and I'm excited to go back. Again, I love people, and these are. I feel like I get as much from them as hopefully I contribute to them.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, they certainly are getting an immense package of personal experience and as we've said, contacts and the work that you're doing and passion too. I mean, you're talking about forced labor is quite. It's obviously something that you know a lot about technically, but also you feel quite strongly about, and that's an impressive combination.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of your podcast. I hope you'll invite me again.
Oh, absolutely. I really want to thank you, Ana Hinojosa, for talking about your incredibly eventful career and sharing some of your insights that have emerged from decades of high-level work in the worlds of customs and immigration. This has been a real education for me, and no doubt will be an education and stimulate a lot of questions and reactions from our listeners.
Thanks again. I really appreciate it.
This concludes my 3-part Pencast conversation with Ana Hinojosa, former Executive Director of U.S. Customs and Border Protection and current head of ABH Global Trade Consulting. Tune in soon for another conversation with customs innovators, leaders, and trendsetters. Thank you.